Perhaps some of you know the story of the Stonewall riots and about the birth of the gay rights movement in the late 1960s in New York City, or maybe you don't. I grew up 7 blocks from where this story began and didn't learn anything about it until I was an adult. And I thought it was worthy of a retelling here as part of our history and part of the background of today's observances. Maybe you know that the year was 1969 and the setting was the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar in New York City's Greenwich Village. This was a time when being gay or lesbian was still a very dangerous thing, and there were very few places where such folks were safe to express their true selves. And the Stonewall Inn was a respite for that, sort of. All gay bars at that time, most of which were run by the mafia, were regularly raided by the police. Their patrons were all arrested and sometimes beaten. At that time, it was not only illegal to be homosexual, it was illegal in the city of New York to serve a drink to someone who was known to be gay. So it wasn't as though these were like safe spaces at all, but in the time between these raids and shakedowns, there was a bit of sanctuary that couldn't be found anywhere else. In fact, the Stonewall Inn was one of the only bars in New York City, gay bars in New York City at the time, where you could dance. It's one of the only places where people in the LGBT community in that moment were able to come together and express some sort of normalcy and joy. And so they would gather and regularly and drink and dance and talk with each other. And when the lights flashed on and off, everyone knew it was a sign that the police were coming for another raid, and the patrons would all try to leave, and if they couldn't, they'd be arrested and maybe get roughed up a little bit, and the police would haul away all the liquor, and then they would get paid off by the mafia, and then the cycle would start all over again. But something different happened on the night of June 28th, 1969. On that night, the raid was typical, but the response was not. The police arrived, the lights flashed on and off, people in the bar tried to leave, and the officers started to arrest folks as they were accustomed to doing. But there was a delay in the arrival of the police vans that were meant to take all these folks they had arrested to jail. And in all that extra time, when these arrested parties were sitting outside the bar waiting to be carted away, they started to fight back. They said, to heck with this. They tried to escape. And there weren't enough officers to really manage them. There were so many of them. A crowd began to grow right outside the bar with both released patrons and bystanders. It soon was in the hundreds and still no van. The atmosphere, so it was said, was both riotous and kind of carnival-like edging on violence, but also very joyful. Some patrons organized a can-can line and began to dance as the officers struggled to control them and all the people in handcuffs and the whole situation. Others were yelling very creative insults, which I won't name here. There were a few drag queens present who led the entire gathered group in song. And the legend says that as a lesbian named Stormy de Lavarier was being escorted out in handcuffs and kind of fighting to escape, she yelled to the whole gathered crowd, "Why don't you guys do something?" And they did. Something snapped in that moment. Fights broke out. The crowd rushed forward. Some of those who had been arrested escaped. The whole crowd joined in protest. Hours later, they were still locked in the struggle. They still didn't have enough officers to control this crowd. Some were inside, still too afraid to come out. Things finally died down about 4 a.m., but the crowd just came back the next night. Ultimately, that uprising lasted for 6 days, eventually swelling into thousands of people crowded around this little, tiny, out-of-the-way place on Christopher Street. And that one incident is widely seen as the catalyst that would unify the various disparate efforts active in the country at that time to advocate for protections for LGBT folks, the beginning of what is now known as the gay rights movement. And I think about that scene so often, especially here around Pride time, not just because it's from my old neighborhood, because there's just such an interesting metaphor for our journey together toward justice, right? I think about that explosive combination of fear and also courage, of violence and joy. I think about that spontaneous explosion of agency that occurred in the streets last night. that beautiful convergence that led a bunch of marginalized people and the others who stood beside them to decide that human dignity was worthy of a fight. And I'm so moved by that scene because I think there's so much beauty there, and it's not hard for me to imagine myself in that story. I think about how over my career in this institution, the church, which has had many of its own struggles trying to figure out which kinds of dignity to affirm, I think about how I've had a lot of choices to make about who I want to be in this story. A legalist enforcing an understanding of decency and order that oppresses some in order to ensure the comfort of others. An opportunist who is happy to have my queer siblings' presence as long as it is convenient, but not be a meaningful part of their liberation. Or an ally who risks herself to join the fight when summoned to do so. Now, I have made all those different choices in my career in ministry, in my time in the church. And I am glad to say that on the balance, not always, not forever, not perfectly, but on the balance, I've been moving toward allyship. And I will tell you that that has meaningfully enhanced not only my ministry, but also my life. And that has given me an ever-expanding, often challenging, and always wondrous understanding of God's creative endeavor in me and in all of humanity, as well as the Spirit's movements toward justice. And I know that over time, this kind of inclusion has become a central facet of both my work and my identity, no longer something I'm willing to have compromise about. In fact, it's one of the reasons I considered coming to this church, because its witness on LGBT inclusion matched my own. I would never have come if it hadn't have been for that. And I really want to push us to expand and deepen that commitment in the years to come, because I think we need it more than ever. I think that because I know that 52% of LGBT kids and youth in our country thought about suicide at least once last year. 52%. They are 4 times more likely to die by suicide than their straight, cisgendered peers. 4 times. Those numbers jump dramatically higher for transgender, non-binary kids and for LGBT kids of color. It's a health and safety crisis, but it's also a spiritual crisis, because if our purpose is to get the word out that all of God's children are beloved and worthy of safety and dignity and care, as we say to our own little ones who are gathered here on Sunday, the message is not getting out there yet. We still have so much work to do. Perhaps you've noticed that not all Christians in our country or in the world agree with us on this. New bans on gender-affirming care are sweeping the nation and terrorizing family of non-binary kids and youth, the doctors that care for them, and the communities that have made commitment to keep them safe. And I know that it can be demoralizing for those of us who are engaged in such a fight to feel like we might be outmatched. I don't know if you ever feel that way. Or maybe that feeling just matches something that you're facing in your own life or your own soul. Like, can I really do all this? Can I really make even a tiny difference? The problem is so big, and I am so small. And to you I say, I hope you were listening to that story that Scott just told us. You know, Jesus tells this parable in the gospel about how spreading the word is like scattering seed. It may be familiar to many of you who have been sitting in these pews for a while. You spread the seed, which is the good news, and some of it takes and grows. And some of it is choked out by misdirection and malfeasance, and some of it is withered by fear and distraction. So Jesus tells this story. But if you keep reading on, you'll notice that Jesus does not tell his followers to stop scattering seed, or tell them, now pay attention and be sure to scatter it only where you know that it will grow. His good news in this parable is rather that in time, the seed that does sprout and root will grow and grow and grow. In time, it ends up being enough, more than enough, to meet every need. And I think the good news then in this story is that that's our job, folks, just to spread seeds as much as we can and not to stop when it seems like some of it is wasted. to spread the seeds of good news and of love and of confidence in God's grace, to spread the seed of trust and assurance, to spread the seed of mercy and joy, and to trust that the Spirit can be in work in those machinations to bring about enough justice, enough peace, enough space and security for everyone. And what I'm going to do right now is to leave you right here and to go downtown to that parade. And is it going to be a little bit edgy? Probably. Is it going to be a little bit dangerous? Maybe in these day and age, who can say? But I also know that it will be so full of joy. And I hope you can make those connections in some way in your own life today, scattering the seeds of what is most valuable and important to you throughout this world. And I hope we will find more ways to do that together in the days to come. And I hope you know that as you go, this pastor loves you. Thanks. And we give these words in the name of the God who created, redeemed, and sustained every one of us. I'm going to invite us now to respond in song.